The time has come for the final dungeon. That's Arah at the end of the chain. Dungeon number 8 is special for a number of reasons. First of all, it's way harder, particularly at launch, than any of the other dungeons, with much more challenging obstacles to get through. But also, it has 4 paths instead of the 3 we've been seeing in the other dungeons. That 4th path is extra long and extra detailed, with a lot more stuff to get through. So this video is probably going to be split into 2 parts just to cover the sheer amount of content. What I'll also say about Arah is that it's here we find a lot of really powerful lore backing some of the biggest mysteries of the game. As you've seen throughout the story, we've seen a lot with the current 5 races and their struggle against the Elder Dragons, but we know that the Elder Dragons rose once before, and we know the last time they rose, there were a different selection of races, the Elder races, dealing with them. But our information about them is spotty at best. The most we know about would be from the dwarves, and there's only a single dwarf here on Tyria, the Ulfric last saw at the Derman Priory. Well, Arah will return us to that dwarf. Ogden Stonehealer is a major feature of Arah, and he's going to help us within the city of the gods learn about those other ancient races. It's pretty fantastic, and so we got a lot to get through with both mechanics and with story. Now, I thought Ulfric would be a really cool character to go through this dungeon with. He hasn't had much of a spotlight in the dungeon so far. So the ranger build, I've got him set up right now, beast mastery, marksmanship, and skirmishing, is not too different from what I had in the open world. The really key components when you take a ranger into dungeons, particularly around 2012, was to try and get this trait here, spotter. This improves the precision of your nearby allies, allowing them to critically hit more and get their massive ferocity bonuses off of their berserker gear. But also, you can buff their damage in some other small ways. You can get reasonable fury for your team with something like Clarion Bond. Some pets can give fury, and then that can bump their crit chance even higher. And then lastly, you can give them spirits. There are 2 really nice spirits for damage. You've got the Sun Spirit, which gives people burning as they strike. Not too shabby. And then the much more frequently used Frost Spirit, which straight up gives you more flat damage as you strike, and flat damage is obviously oh so powerful within dungeons. For weapons, you'll see I have a greatsword here. You could run a variety of things. Over here I've got axe. Probably sword axe would have been the more conventionally ran thing back in the day, but what I really point out is axe offhand, which has this beautiful skill here, whirling defenses. This is a reflect. It's a little bit trickier to use than say some of the mesmer reflects or guardian reflects, but if you position yourself just right, whirling defenses can do some beautiful stuff in dungeons. There used to be a trait that would make it bigger. I think that's now removed from the game, and by default it's always the bigger radius, but I could be wrong about that. Anyway, Ranger wasn't necessarily the most favored thing in launch for dungeons, but it did have these very powerful tools such as the Frost Spirits that I'll be using as we head on in. Most of the rest of the build is all about buffing damage. Scholar runes, sigils of force, sigils of undead slaying, as we'll be dealing with a lot of, as you can guess, undead in this one. And of course, berserker or assassin's mix. So let's head on over to Lion's Arch to get a bit of flavor text. For the last time this time, here's the dungeon historian. He says, we say, what can you tell me about dungeons? We say, tell me about Arah. He says, Arah was the first city built in Tyria. Its majesty was twisted and corrupted when Zhaitan awoke, and it became a dangerous place, lost to foul beasts and the undead. So there are a billion different things the devs can draw from with a dungeon in Ore. You can do underwater things, you can do stuff predating the underwater if you can conceivably find a way for it to have survived. More on that later. And then they mix in the undead and finally the elder races, the gods. What a great setting. Thanks for the information. Let's move on and see what we've got. I'll note I obviously could have changed our pets for this to be more worthwhile. Using big cats is typically one of the highest damage things you can do, but I like our owl and I like our wolf, and I think we should generally be okay in the dungeon. Moving over to Captain Scott.
You can't hide anything from me.
He says, now that story's done, Zhaitan has been defeated, but its minions continue to fight inside Arah. Ogden went there to discover the secrets of the elder races. So this is fantastic, actually getting some dialogue pointing out that Zaitan has been defeated. Nowhere else in the core game for 2012 could you find an NPC like that. In Kershaw, the nearest map to the end of the game, it's perpetually in a state of the god temples going and the meta's pushing towards the gates. And as you move back through the earlier maps, the story just recedes until eventually the Pact outposts don't even appear and we're back to domestic issues. But this one guy will talk about it, and I always thought that was really fun. Let's talk a little bit about Ogden. Ulfric can ask who's Ogden and what Elder Race is. Let's just say he forgot after such a long adventure, because obviously we have met Ogden. He says Ogden's Stone Healer. He's one of the last dwarves, works with the Derman Priory, and is on a mission to learn more about the Elder Dragons. One reason I was really excited to show the Norn story with joining the Orders is because you get Ogden, and he does become a bigger player in the story later, starting here at Arah. For most players, I dare say, it was only in Arah Explorable they ever really met him. Think about this. You're playing any of the races that's not a Norn, and you don't join the Priory. That's a pretty easy selection of decisions to come to, and if you do that, you don't meet him at all. You can maybe, while exploring the world, get a hint at him outside the Priory with his little point of interest, Ogden's quarters. And then all of a sudden he's here and alive and well, and it's not treated as this extraordinary thing necessarily by the Pact, but you do get this little line of dialogue saying Ogden's Stone Healer. And of course he's prominent not just as the final dwarf, not just because I'm telling you that later he'll become a big deal, but he's actually one of the biggest characters from Guild Wars 1 in the Eye of the North expansion that was all about setting up Guild Wars 2. So to have Ogden's Stone Healer be a set piece in the final explorable dungeon, the end game experience everyone ultimately would be headed towards, was a fantastic move from the devs. So, he's one of the last dwarves, works with the Derman Priory, and is on a mission to learn more about the Elder Dragons. We just asked, what about Elder Races? Can you expand on that? He says, yeah, Ogden has a list of races that were around during and survived the last incursion of the dragons. They were dwarves, seers, forgotten, Jotun, and Massart. Why Jotun and Massart aren't capitalized, I couldn't quite tell you. In fact, dwarves aren't either, so why only these two, I suppose. But you get 5 races here. There are 4 paths within the dungeon, because Ogden himself does not actually represent a path. More on that later. It's payoff on a bit of trivia I gave you at Fort Trinity recently. We can say, what can I do? And instead of the generic meet 5 people and head on in, we get an actual answer here. Ogden believes the human gods gathered more information here. Head into Arah, but don't go alone. Take 4 others to guard your back and flanks. You'll find Ogden is in there. Let me just linger on this for a very quick second. Ogden believes the human gods gathered more information here. Now, the dungeon doesn't do a very good job stressing this point or going over it, but essentially the idea with this is that the gods, once they came to Tyria, gathered various powerful artifacts and remnants of past societies. Remember, the previous Elder Dragon Rising and these ancient races were at a timescale of 10,000 years. The gods coming here is only a timescale of 1,000 years, thereabouts-ish. So when the gods arrived, this Tyria was already strewn with the remains and artifacts of this past time, and they gathered them here and put them at Arah. That's why we get this beautiful idea of a dungeon that's got all this amazing lore to do with the gods and to do with the ore itself, and all the elder races bundled in at the same time. You can combine this lore with the separate story of how Vizier Kilbron read from a forbidden lost scroll at the vaults beneath Arah. That scroll caused the cataclysm, sinking the nation and turning him into an undead lich. The suggestion then, maybe, being the gods gathered scrolls like that. They were artifacts related to the Elder Dragons and the ancient races, and then Kilbron unwittingly unleashed its power many years later without their consent. That's why maybe he became a lich and got power over the undead with that. It could have been that the Lost Scroll was an artifact from the ancient races, the last Elder Dragon Rising, particularly tied with Zaitan, who all the while was sleeping beneath the gods and Kilbron's feet. Zaitan being undeady, the scroll being undeady. That's all just speculation though. I wonder if in the headiest, earliest days, when time crunch and budgeting wasn't a constraint for the devs as they conceptualized the games, they were excited about the idea of not having this one endgame dungeon, but having lots, each in a distinct different place, each dedicated to one of the ancient races. But instead, we get them all bundled here at Arah, and I still think it's a really good decision. So, working up to the entrance, it says here, after Zaitan's defeat, the Pact is exploring the human city of the gods to gain more knowledge about the Elder Dragons. We can enter explorable mode. It's one of the paths of this dungeon, path 3 for Arah, that was one of the first explorable paths I ever played. And so I have fond memories of this, and it kind of set me up to believe that all the dungeons would have as epic story as is going on here, but that doesn't necessarily end up the case. So, entering Arah, one piece of trivia I did point out why we were in story mode was that the story mode is made to look like explorable, but not actually be explorable. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, if we press M and look at our world map, you'll see we do still expand all the way down here, and you do still see it says Ruined City of Arah way down this way, but it's not actually true that we'll go anywhere near any of this anymore. All the airship content and places we flew over, miles in the sky, especially getting anywhere near the Dragon's Roost and that point of interest, that is not actually a part of this instance. The instance is massive. This is still probably the biggest explorable dungeon, and you'll see that. There are enormous wide plains. The place rivals the size of Queensdale, at least I would say, but it doesn't take you all the way off into those super distant airship lands. What we're actually playing is a different map. And if you look really closely at the details around, like the position of plants and some of the rocks and boulders and things, you'll see that it's not the same. If we look down this hole, you'll see there are spiders here. I think in story, obviously the spiders weren't here. The devs can mess with spawns. That's not world geometry. But that's actually deep water you can swim in as well if you choose to fall down. I'm going to ignore it since Ulfric is alone right now. But moving a little bit deeper in, you'll see we get loads of prior researchers. It's no longer stormy and nighttime and raining, but instead a clear, cool, crisp day where you can see the arches that extend presumably way out into the Cursed Shore. Like that one there would be like one of the Cursed Shore ones, arching all the way out. And yeah, that does mean it's day, so you would use daytime weapons here and specific Arah weapons just to take out the creatures here if you really wanted to min-max in this dungeon. Something I always liked, that I had specific undead slaying weapons, and we'll be using those as we go through on this adventure to really grind out every little last drop of damage. We're at a full level 80 scale, so the numbers we see here are as big as they could be in the core game. I do want to run forward a little bit here as well. And you'll notice that these undead are continuously swarming the camp, but these are all really weak undead that we can pretty much just blow up. They don't really represent a threat, and our pact allies will infinitely respawn to fight against them. It's just a bit of flavor, but what it does mean is you can run Bloodlust sigils, which are sigils that give you extra damage over time the more kills you get, to instantly max out your Bloodlust stacks right here at the start of Arah if you like. And that was something I often used to do. But if you look at this guy, he's level 75. We're level 80. He's so low level here that his nameplate is even starting to appear a little bit in green. So this is just for a little bit of fun and nothing else really. So there is a lot more to talk about, and I'll show you more differences in this version of the map compared to story. But let's have a look over here next at all of the various NPCs. So we've got Warden Ilra, we've got Scholar Yisa, we've got Vara Skylark, we've got Randall Greystone. A human, a Norn, an Asura, and a Silvari. In front of them, we have Ogden. Now, all of these should be NPCs you recognize. Ogden, obviously, from Guild Wars 1, the Dermot Priory, the Norn stories. But these guys at the back did appear in the Fort Trinity instance right near the end of the game, before we assaulted Arah. They were huddled in a circle, talking about how they were excited to explore the place should we be able to defeat the Elder Dragon. And indeed, we did. But you'll remember that they did have, not Ogden, a 5th NPC with them. They had a Char. There is no Char with them. That was the hint that maybe the devs had a plan to do 5 paths. There would be a dwarven path led by a Char NPC, and all 5 playable races would be represented here in Arah. But when we finally get here into Explorable, there is no Char standing along with them. And instead, Ogden, a dwarf, is our generic sort of guiding NPC. This makes me think that actually the inclusion of Ogden here as the original quest giver might have been something of a last-minute decision, and originally, the dwarves were going to get an entire 5th path for themselves in Arah, and we would have had not Ogden here, but the Char leading us through that. It's kind of a toss-up. What's cooler, having Ogden here to represent that dwarf influence as an ancient race, or to give them a whole path of lore and a Char that's particularly interested in them? We're going to see as well that the specific race that each character is looking at somewhat ties to their race. So what do I mean by that? Well, the scholar interested in the Jotun is a Norn. And, well, we can see the similarities between the Jotun and the Norn. The story that we're going to be dealing with the Asura, who's interested in the Masat, you'll see they draw ties. There's ties also sneakily being drawn to the Silvari. While you watch this path, be sure to pay close attention and think about that. It is hinting at upcoming stories. And then finally, the human story is definitely tied to what we know about the race he's interested in. So then you can wonder, what would the Char have that was so close to the dwarves? What parallel would the devs have drawn? I really don't know. The closest I can get is that the dwarves are actually quite an industrial race. When they were still alive and thriving 250 years ago in the first game, they had these amazing quarries and mines, and they carved into the mountains, and they had like clockwork mechanisms. They were even looking into firearms and explosives with gunpowder. And, well, we do see that industrious nature in the Char too, so maybe that's what they would have drawn. Because, you know, the Char technology, I would say, is industrious, while the Asura is more magitech, right? And maybe that's what they would have been going for, but we can only guess these days. So, Ulfric, once again, gets to meet with Ogden, and we can see what's going on. He says, thank you for coming here to help us uncover the secrets of Arah. Is this your entire group here with you? Well, not just yet. We're alone. I'll explain more of that in a second. The other thing I'll say is, thankfully, with Arah, you don't have to speak to all the NPCs first before triggering the cutscene. In the other dungeons, you have to do that, and the devs weirdly overlapped. On this dungeon, they're a lot more efficient about it. You can ignore them until the last minute. They always have the same dialogue. So, we're all here. Let's begin. Hello, Ogden.
This isn't the first time the dragons have risen. The Tome of the Rubicon speaks of the dwarves fighting the dragons' champions. We have since learned of other races having fought the dragons long ago. Mersat, Jotun, Forgotten, and Seers. Their secrets are to be found within this ruined city of the human gods. We have experts on each race, all seeking this lost knowledge. Choose one of them and help us discover how to better fight the remaining elder dragons.
I do want to be very clear here. Ogden is a member of one of these ancient races, the dwarves, but he wasn't around 10,000 years ago. I know that we now think of him as this immortal being, since he just survived the most recent 250 years, having been turned to stone. But he is still very young. He was alive as a regular flesh and blood creature 250 years ago during the time of Guild Wars 1, which is still 9,750 years later than his previous dwarves would have actually been fighting the Elder Dragons. So while Ogden can help a good bit, and a good bit more than most contemporary Tyrians, he's still just, you know, a drop in the water compared to how many thousands of years back the subject material we're now diving into actually is. So, if we press F on him again, he says, with Zaitan's defeat, we can explore the city of the human gods and uncover its secrets. And we say, what secrets are those? The human gods built this repository of ancient knowledge of the races that preceded us in Tyria. Our scholars here are specialists of those 4 ancient races. So here, look, the gods built this repository of ancient knowledge. They gathered all this stuff together, and for what purpose? To learn more about it? To play with it? Well, one of these paths will certainly suggest that. But also, there are maybe some suggestions. They might have done it to conceal evidence that something dangerous might be happening here on Tyria, that there might be a threat of the Elder Dragons, that they didn't want their humans, they just shepherded in and whatever else to really be looking too deeply at. Though one of these paths will suggest in a second the gods didn't know anything about the dragons. That'll be up for us to debate very soon. We can say, who is here with you? He says, packed forces are still engaged with Zaitan's minions throughout Arah. The Priory believes it is vital to preserve the ancient knowledge here from destruction. So yes, this is also a really important line, being a post-game storyline. in that it's talking quite specifically about the fact that Zaitan's minions still exist even though their master has been slain, and they are still ambling around doing what they can to destroy things and tamper with us. So what ancient knowledge is that, we say? And he circles back to what we had before. We can ask him, what's your role here? He says, I'm the last of dwarves. The dwarves? Dwarves? Most of my people have gone down into the depths of Tyria to fight the elder dragon Primordus. I have remained here to help the Priory. And we kind of already know about that. And so, yeah, we get the 3 bits of dialogue that are cycling. And we can say, I look forward to working with them. So we get to pick a scholar. Let's just be very clear about the timelines. First, ages ago, you have the ancient races and the elder dragons on their previous rising. Then you have thousands of year gap. Then you have the gods arriving. Then you have another huge gap. And you get Guild Wars 1 and Ogden being born. Then you get a 250-year gap. And you get us. Okay, so that's hopefully enough to be clear for you all as to how far back in time we're looking. So, for NPCs, you might think they're ordered Path 1, Path 2, Path 3, Path 4. They're actually not. Path 1 instead is going to be starting with the Norn. So it'll be very cool for Ulfric to check this out.
Hands-on academic.
This is Vara Skylark, and she says the Jotun were once a powerful and magical people, knowledgeable both in sorcery and natural philosophy. Now, Ulfric knows a lot about the Jotun, and to an extent the Codan because of the horn, right? But we started this adventure really looking at the Jotun and their ancient ways. We had that vision showing their collapse and how they kind of destroyed themselves, and there was all this sense of them lashing out in blood, right? So we could say knowledgeable in spells. The Jotun, they're just brutes wandering the mountains, right? Well, she says they were great spellcasters once, but they sacrificed that knowledge in blood. And of course, as a Norn, having seen the stories we've seen, we know a little bit more detailed about this. What can you tell me about Jotun philosophy? They understood the ways of the sky and the movements of the heavens. Many of their monument stones are actually stellar maps, and their stargazers were legendary. Wow, so these stones we've been walking past, we interacted with one to get that vision before. They're stellar maps. We say, why is there Jotun magic here in Arah? And she says there are ancient Jotun legends of a sky sweeper, a great magical observatory. I believe that the human gods brought that mystic telescope here and rebuilt it. So, yeah, we think about this amazing Jotun society with all this power and richness and culture, and they build this amazing device, right? You think of it, the pinnacle accomplishment of their society, a magical telescope that can look at the stars. Isn't that just a wonderful thought, guys? Looking out at the stars in the sky, as maybe no other contemporary races have even really considered doing that. Tyrian astronomy. Well, they built this thing, the Sky Sweeper. The societies were destroyed, fell into disrepair, but the gods found it. And look, they tinkered with it. They rebuilt it. The gods themselves seem pretty cool in that they were able to rebuild the thing and hide it here. So we can say, wow, what should we do if we come across that telescope? And she says the Jotun believed that the coming of the elder dragons was reflected in the heavens. If I can find their telescope, I can prove that. Now remember, each of the races that are being represented here did somehow survive the rising of the previous elder dragons. They did do it. They didn't destroy the dragons, as we've just managed to destroy one, but they managed to survive. So who knows how they did that and why their fights against the dragons failed, but they managed to survive anyway. These are big questions, and the Jotun may have used this telescope to be able to predict stuff and anticipate things in advance. So what can you tell me about Jotun philosophy? They understood the ways of the sky and the movements of the heavens. Many of their monument stones are... Oh, we already read that. That's my bad. Why don't I remember reading the first thing there? Their stargazers were legendary, so then she's just going to rotate through. Now, here's the funny thing about this, guys, as well. Ulfric actually already knows a lot about the Jotun, because interestingly, the developers added a lot of Jotun lore, ancient race lore, specifically to this race. However, there are no personal story branches, as you well know if you've watched the whole series, that truly dive in to the Forgotten, or the Massart, or the Seers, but the Jotun do. So it's interesting how there's a bit of crossover there. This one will feel a little bit familiar, but the others is pretty much totally uncharted territory. So yeah, I'm ready to choose a scholar. I want to choose you. Here we get the voting, and we can say Vara Skylark and the Jotun.
The Jotun are now primitive brutes, but they were once brilliant and highly magical. They studied the world and the heavens, and inscribed their discoveries on their great monument stones. My study of those stones in the Shiver Peaks leads me to believe that they knew when the dragons would awaken. That knowledge was found by the human gods and brought here to Arah. Our scouts have found old monument stones here among the wreckage. I think they point to where an ancient Jotun observatory may be found. Come with me, and together we can learn the secret of the Jotuns.
Brilliant. So, interacting with Arah again, you'll see she just says the same stuff that the dungeon opened with. And sadly, despite the amazing subject material of the lore in this dungeon, they really aren't as good as, say, Crucible of Eternity or some of the earlier dungeons in giving us a body of dialogue to read through. Sometimes they'll update a little bit as the paths go along, but mostly you just ask the same thing. In principle, I think this is a good idea for like clarity for players who may have missed the start of the dungeon and want to quickly catch up in the middle of the path, but it's disappointing to me as a lore enthusiast. Ogden also has the same dialogue, unfortunately, so we don't get to say goodbye to him or whatever, and that's mostly what he's going to do in the dungeon, stand around being our original, explanation as to what's going on. And again, we don't get that Path 5. Speaking of Path 5, and by the way, how cool is that idea? Just having all the dungeons be 3 paths and the final one be 5. It's pretty epic, right? Speaking of Path 5, I do believe that this is possibly where they would have had the entrance, between these 2 blue lampposts, which sort of subtly guide you where you need to go as the dungeon goes along. I can just imagine a door being here, you would have wandered through, and there would have been some kind of underground sequence. Every single Arah path will eventually take us to one central chamber, right where all of these archways combine, and I can just imagine an underground route leading us directly in there. So, let's get a move on. Now, I do, unfortunately, guys, have a bit of bad news. As you can see, I'm not in a party. We haven't grouped up with anyone just yet. And, well, by the time I do get my team here for this adventure, I will have realized that Ulfric is not significantly less geared than some of the other characters that we've been playing with. And in fact, to have the smoothest ride through this dungeon, which genuinely can be a struggle for people, I instead decided to play on a different tune. Well, the only other guy I think that would be really cool if we're not going through this with Ulfric, if he's doomed to just see the entrance and participate a little bit, regroup with Ogden and learn what was going on, I think would probably be to play our Char, right? Since there is no Char representation in the dungeon, that means Tyrix will actually be the one to beat Arah. And Ulfric will just be our guy that gets a look in and a little bit of a tour as far as we've got so far. Hopefully that seems reasonable to you all. Hey, he got about half an hour. That's like the full length of one of the other paths. And yeah, so let's swap on over now to the party and we'll see what we've got. Tyrix is on the same setup that we saw in the Citadel of Flame, so not much to talk about there. However, because he'll now be at level 80, you're going to see the numbers go much higher. I've also equipped him, since this is a daytime dungeon, with sigils of undead slaying and potions of powerful undead slaying, which means we get a full 20% extra damage against the most of the Orien abominations. It's going to be really cool and really juicy to see how hard he hits. Oh, and also, remember how last time we went to the Citadel of Flame, I said it might be fun to loot something extra from it? Well, it's this. Check it out. A new greatsword, Volcanus. Volcanus is a Mystic Forge acquired skin that you get from buying a Gift of Balefire at the dungeon NPC. That's the Citadel of Flame special currency. And combining with lots of lodestones, chili peppers, and other, honestly, pretty difficult to get materials. You pull it out, and you get this very rare, very badass looking greatsword. It's actually the Elementalist elite skill Conjure Fiery Greatsword, but we have it as a permanent skill now. And doesn't that just complete the fiery look to complement the Fiery Dragon Sword we have on the other set? Amazing. Maybe one day we'll get a new Fiery Axe too, but that'll be a lot later. So at last it's time to begin. You'll notice the team, we have an Elementalist, that's a core healing Elementalist with a staff. We have a Mesmer, which will be extremely useful as the dungeon proceeds. We have a Ranger for exactly the same build I just showed you on Ulfric, and a Thief, running a fairly unconventional condition damage Venom Thief. Many of the players in the party here had never done Arah before, and it can be a very challenging one, so we'll see how we do. I want to show you guys first of all what happens if we try and walk directly up to the city, beyond this staircase nearby. You may remember from the various lore scriptures and excerpts all over the game about the city of the gods, where they talked about great clean courtyards that people would patrol to impress Balthazar and the gods hid away from the rest of humanity, that this place was kept clean and clear and pristine for all those years. Well, a lot of those references you kind of don't get to see much of, I'm afraid to say. Though, there are some incredible place names, areas to unfog, and points of interest, just hinting at extremely high fantasy and wonderful concepts. I can't wait to show you them. So as we move forward, this time you'll see there's not just a door on the left, but a door on the right. That wasn't true in Explorable. And this staircase in front of us that's broken, well, we have to somehow get up those rocks to progress into the central areas of the dungeon. All 4 paths take you to that same area, but each one in a different way. For us on path 1, we're going to be going north here and through the same doorway that we started in story mode. One of the main mechanics you'll face through all the paths of Arah is this: dead Orion bodies. There's no nameplate or user interface to show you that anything special is going on. You have to truly look at the environment, very much in accordance with the way Guild Wars 2 is meant to be played. If you walk over them, the bodies explode and do massive damage. You'll see there I just got killed, not by any enemies, just by the environment and standing on these bodies. You'll also notice, no matter how much I dodge, I can't actually avoid taking the impact of damage. I swear back in the day it didn't work that way, and you could dodge the bodies, but maybe I'm misremembering. The point is, in 2019, stay away from the bodies. Here we have 2 varieties of Risen to face, and you'll see we kill them quite quickly, but especially that illusionist, the undead Mesmer, can be very deadly. They have laser beam abilities that pin players down, doing extreme damage, and chaos storms with massive AoE potential. So make sure you focus them and get your crowd controls and stuns and knockbacks on them to prevent their skills more than anything else. Next, we have some ooze to fight. These also appear all over the dungeon and have an interesting mechanic in that first they splash a lot of weakness on you, thus really hurting your power damage, but also when they die, they split into these lesser ooze. It's a bit like how Subject Alpha dies and turns into those tar elementals. The ooze used to be designed, the lesser ones, that they would walk together, and if you allowed them to recombine, the elite ooze would reappear and you'd have to fight it again. A resurrection mechanic that often you don't see much of at all in Guild Wars 1 or 2. But if you saw the lesser oozes, you could pull them apart, kill them, they're much squishier than the big ones, and you could prevent that often happening. While playing this dungeon here for you guys today, I can't help but notice the lesser ooze just seem bugged. Watch closely in the background. Sometimes they can spawn on cliffs, and that's always been true, but they just stand there, not moving, and then eventually despawn. So maybe this mechanic is totally broken, or it's flimsy at best. Most players, as with all dungeons, would skip most of this stuff you're watching us fight right now. And in fact, out of all dungeons in the entire game, Arah has the highest quantity of content that gets skipped by a long way. Just a bit of stealth and using movement to rush through means most of these paths, I would guess you can skip about 85 to 90% of all enemies just by moving to the specific boss sequences. Here's another mechanic. You can pick up these reflecting crystals on the ground, which repel these projectiles these Orion guard turrets fire at you. The turrets do okay damage, but they'll kill you by death by 1,000 cuts, and they spam blind every time they hit you. So as you can see here, and I'm trying to break these turrets, unless I can hit really quickly, I can't do any damage. The best way to get around it? Projectile reflects. And you'll watch my Mesmer doing very well, dropping temporal curtains and feedbacks to make sure those reflects are actually landing, and then the turrets will go down super quick. Story mode actually taught us a little bit about these, but you'll see a lot more of them here in Explorable. Another group of Risen here, we're fighting, but you don't have to. And you'll see the Chaos Storm I mentioned a second ago. There are 2 illusionists in this packet, and when they slam it on you, they can easily put you well below half health, even on a warrior that has a lot of defense rating and a lot of vitality. Playing Elementalists back in the day, I would hate those things. They could always kill me so quickly. If you watch closely there, I avoided a body, but one of my other players popped it. That's something you always have to keep in mind in Arah, and often in intense boss sequences, you'll find yourself going down because you stepped in the wrong place, and it's super frustrating. But at least, once the body's gone once, it's gone for good. Killing this optional group of spiders, we can move over to these rune stones that light up with a nice subtle animation, and the Jotun spirit will speak to us.
There, a Jotun monument stone uncorrupted by the Elder Dragon's influence. Hold on. Something is manifesting. Yes!
I know your desires. You seek the wisdom of the Jotun. Speak with me, and if I find you worthy, a mystic Jotun stone will be your reward.
So this guy is just called a Stargazer. There is no specific title or reference to him anywhere else in lore. I think it would have been really fun if they tied that to some of the earlier story that Norn could experience, but they never did. You'll notice Vara does not have anything new to say, and that'll be a recurring theme. The Stargazer says, within this veil lives a beast that has fed on blood for centuries. Bring me a vial of its blood to prove your worth, and I shall grant you the wisdom you seek. And we say, what kind of creature do we hunt? He says it's an amorphous beast that has lived since the sinking of ore, feasting on the dead. Sounds nasty. Let's go get it. So very Norny, we're actually going to be going on a big hunt now. The description of a beast in a veil there reminds me very much of what it felt like getting underworld quests in Guild Wars 1. But maybe I'm just being nostalgic and other people don't feel the same way. This beast does predate the sinking of ore, and it was described as amorphous. So what kind of creature might it be? Well, don't hold out for anything too impressive in terms of lore. It's actually just a legendary variety of something we've already been fighting. Here we use a line of sight spot to pull this entire group of Risen in and blow them up. Because those Risen are, I guess, mechanically partied with one another, as soon as one aggroes, the whole group comes in, no matter how far away the others were. Again, a glimpse of a Guild Wars 1 mechanism still being used in Guild Wars 2. They do a lot of damage to us. If we had a Guardian for more Aegis, the Thief was using more blinds, or we applied more weakness, you wouldn't be seeing us going down at all. But those are just compositional matters. And generally speaking, with an Arcane Resurrection core elementalist healing, despite how frequently you'll see us go down in this dungeon, we can always res up or rally very quickly. The boss, as you can see there, is, yes, a massive ooze. He's in a room surrounded by bodies and more turrets, which I do suggest you clear out if it's your first run, because the ooze can move around a lot. Expert teams wouldn't have killed much of this stuff, instead pulling the ooze to another area, and you could do an exploity thing where you climbed on a cliff and he wouldn't be able to hit you at all in the past, but we'll try and do it the proper way. The first main animation that the ooze uses is this, a bounce, bounce, bounce skill that he holds in place and does lots of blowouts and big damage. In general, this is going to play out very similarly to the optional ooze boss we fought in the Citadel of Flame, and you can see how hard this one's hitting us. As a legendary, he's definitely a formidable foe. I remember the first time I ever fought this guy, I couldn't quite tell how it was possible at all to destroy him. He just seemed to have so much CC so fast, and seemed to be so tanky, that without using a cliff climbing exploity trick, it just seemed like a ludicrous prospect. These days with the power creep, it feels a little bit more balanced actually. You'll notice as soon as we aggroed the boss, this patrol of extra Risen did come in from the next chamber. They're really dangerous, especially considering one of them is an illusionist, so I tried to get my team to retarget, and we start going down again. The other Risen we're fighting here is another common variety we'll find all over Arah Explorable, is a hunter. They infinitely summon Risen Eagles that are very squishy but do high damage. They also have a Warhorn that means they can give their allies stability, thus protecting them from your temporal curtains and other pulls. You'll see this guy has stabbed right now. And they have a bouncing axe auto attack that will truly rip through your team. Reflects, however, can mean you rip through their team. And if you can reflect a hunter at just the right time, it's a really powerful way to clear out groups of Risen. The damage on it is just nuts. Here, killing the Ancient Ooze, I was expecting a whole new phase to the fight. You'll notice he dropped an item. I'll talk more about that later. But as this was originally designed, this ooze, much like all the others, should have split into other smaller ones that we then have to fight. Right now, we should be killing 2 champion ooze. The legendary one becomes champion, and then the champion ones become elite, and we work our way down. The champion ones had a crazy bullet hell animation where they would spam gunk all over this entire chamber. It was really impressive and scary. Players would often try to run through this dungeon by just quickly killing the legendary, picking up his drop, and rushing back to the Jotun Stargazer in the other room without having to fight the champions altogether. I was ready to do a full clear for you all, but as you can see, in 2019, they don't seem to spawn. When did the devs nerf and change this? That was one of the most impressive things about this dungeon. Difficult, sure, but isn't that the idea of Arah? I don't know when this changed. I cover pretty much every patch note when they come out, and I don't ever remember them talking about it, but there you go. I guess it means the dungeon's a bit shorter at the very least. Carrying this heavy item that forces me to move slow, the blood of the ancients, back to the Stargazer, doesn't trigger any dialogue. He just disappears, we get a chest, and can wait for Vara to pick up the stone.
I have the stone. Let's go.
So, that's one Jotun Rue stone in hand. As she claims it, you might have noticed the blue glow in the environment behind her actually dimmed. It's a nice touch I think most players don't notice. We'll clear out the rest of these ooze, grab the chest, and head on into the next chamber, which is full of enemies, and again, is a great place to just skip utilizing stealth. Any players with a teleport skill can handily teleport up the cliff nearby and have a very easy job of ignoring everything that we're now fighting. Mostly it's going to be ooze, but there are also these drakes. The drakes, again, are very fun to reflect. They have this ability here that launches several projectiles that explode into poison clouds. The poison clouds linger for ages, ticking lots of times and doing impressive poison damage. Now that conditions stack intensity, something that wasn't true back at launch Guild Wars 2, they can be very dangerous. What does that mean? Because the poison clouds initially come from a projectile, if you reflect the projectile, they could be your poison clouds. And one of my favorite experiences to have in Arah is to play a reflect class, like Ulfric could with his axe offhand, and see the hundreds of numbers whirling by as you do both impressive condition damage and flat damage. There are a lot of ooze on this route, and they can be quite tiring to fight just because of their weakness, but it's mostly a path 1 thing. Don't worry, not all of them are so full. I think it's mostly because the first boss here was an ooze. It's a fun idea to suggest that one of the only things that could survive, or while it was a regular above land area, and while it was deep below the sea, would end up being this kind of creature. A jelly-like blob that would be unimpacted by the pressure of the ocean waves. But ooze are not the only thing we'll find that have survived, that are living from those ancient days.
I know your desires. You seek the wisdom of the Jotun. Speak with me, and if I find you worthy, a mystic Jotun stone will be your reward.
So our quest for Jotun stones continues with another Stargazer offering another one. Here I noticed for some reason my weapons were bugged and none of their animations were playing. So I took the time to quickly unequip and re-equip them so we'd actually get to check out our shiny new skin. So this next challenge is a really interesting one. The Stargazer says the light filtering through this toxic sky has turned the beasts here to unbreakable glass. Slay them all to prove your worth, and I will grant you the wisdom you seek. We can ask, how do I break the unbreakable? And no, that's not an Order of Whispers option. And he says the light that made them what they are still shines on ore. Perhaps it will light your way. And we say that sounds vaguely Clue-like. So here, we have ambient enemies. You'll notice they're actually like phantasmal ice broods. I don't think that's necessarily supposed to tie them to Jormag whatsoever. I think it's just the devs wanted something that looked bestial, and they picked something from elsewhere in the game. So don't look too deeply at that. I'm not sure that they take extra damage from sigils of ice brood slaying and whatnot, for example. Maybe there's a suggestion here that these are ice brood or corrupted Jotun, since we are on the Jotun path, but the lore never explicitly says so. But these are ambient creatures that won't fight us until we choose to fight them. Here they're attacking Vara because she's super aggressive and decided to start on them, but as soon as she's dead, they just wander around again. I actually think the devs could have done this more in dungeons, having ambient creatures, but they never really did. You'll notice they do massive damage, but they're pure melee, so as long as I keep moving at reasonable speed in circles, they can't actually hit me much. Likewise, as I strike them, I can't hit them much either. 29 damage? At level 80? Well, that's nothing. Instead, what we need to do is stand in the patches of light here to get this buff, green light. It says it increases our strength at the cost of taking more damage. And that's true. Not only am I ticking damage over time being in this light, but now I'm becoming increasingly vulnerable to them as they're being increasingly vulnerable to me. At about 7 stacks, if I start attacking, you'll notice I did about 20,000 damage in just some stray abilities that time. If you walk out of the light, it will cleanse all of your stacks and thus vulnerability, and you can move back in. So the idea of this sequence is to try and gather as much light as possible to then kill the glass things before they kill you. Here I use my sword too to jump into the other packet of light. And look at this whirling axe. I just did 300,000 damage with a single skill there. Really fun if you like those inflated numbers. And if you've got a team that knows how to do this mechanic, it's always a highlight of Path 1 to me. With them dead, the Jotun will give us the runestone, and we can carry on. Arah just needs to take some time to go claim it, since she died miserably pretty far away. The grand chest here is also easy to miss, particularly if you're a free-to-play player without auto-looting enabled.
I have the mystic Jotun stone.
This next sequence, once again, is a long road that you could skip, even without stealth
in
this
moderation.
time. We're going to be traveling through some wide pathways. Look at how open this field is, with honestly not much to do. But I do want to point out that if you are one of those very rare groups that chooses to kill everything, you can come across these spiders. You may remember if you watched the full dungeon series, in Twilight Arbor, we fought a spider boss called Marona. It did a very weird mechanic, giving us a variant of poison that slowed our movement speed, as well as buffing our damage. I said in Twilight Arbor that the only other place in the game you saw it was in some weird places of Arah. Well, welcome to that place. This is one of those spiders that if you deliberately eat its poison and you don't cleanse it, you'll be able to kill extremely quickly. That's 2 sequences very close to one another where we can get massive damage numbers. Pretty fun, especially now that we're level 80 and you can really see just how high you can climb. The spiders are obviously just as dangerous as Marona in that they have the same one-shot style ability, so be cautious of that. But honestly, if you're struggling, none of this conversation is really relevant, because you can just walk past this area. The spiders won't try that hard to follow you. Though, on that note, there are actually slightly different aggro mechanics going on often in Arah, where normally enemies would chase for only a short while before giving up and leashing away. In Arah, often they run and run and run, much further. That was something we saw that the devs did in their super elite endgame stuff for Guild Wars 1 also, such as the Domain of Anguish, and I think was really worthwhile philosophy. Back when this dungeon was truly epically difficult, it was a component that made things all the more difficult and encouraged you maybe to actually kill things instead of skipping by. Of course, the entire thing becomes irrelevant as soon as you can stealth, something the devs didn't have to contend with in the original game, but do with this one. At the Corrupted Canals, we can find this detonator next to a shot-down packed chopper with a ton of bodies. You can press F on it, and it will instantly clear out this minefield, I guess, filled with all these other Risen. So no, you don't have to fight your way through them. But technically, they weren't elites or anything anyway, and it might be better to kill them manually, as long as you have mechanisms to pull them together, because you can get loot from them. One thing I used to like doing was run down tagging stuff, and then hope one of my party members back in the rear would press the detonator for fun, and I'd be flooded with loot. Again, more long, wide walkways with optional enemies crowded around the edges. I do think they're quite immersively littered around here, like these guys are taking shelter from the sun or something. We're going to walk all the way over to them for no reason at all and kill them. Ooze and Drake combos, just like we saw on the previous walk. This other optional group nearby actually has a champion Drake. He has a special kind of Drake ability, using something similar to the Necromancer Dagger Skill 4. It's a black-green blob that he throws at you in a line, bounces between you and your allies, and loads a ton of conditions up. So be careful of that. Once again, reflect to your friend. This Drake actually might be worthwhile fighting, sometimes, because he can interfere with the next boss sequence. If you're struggling with a boss, the worst thing in the world would be to try and flee away and actually accidentally run into this dude who would finish you off. Even with little reason to fight in these places, I do like how the wide open paths make Arah look. It's a gorgeous dungeon, the sun beating down there. In this occasion, for Path 1, there is no boss where we're currently standing, but remember it, because in another path, there will be, and that's where that Drake we just killed will become more relevant. The next boss for us is a bit further up. I'm going to deliberately pop these bodies because this boss chamber has got a ton of mechanics for us to look at. I actually think it's one of the most layered boss fights in all of the dungeons. Again, most people can ignore because it will die very quickly, but I'm going to give you the whole hog. So here's our next Stargazer.
I know your desires. You seek the wisdom of the Jotun.
We have met with your brethren. We will speak with you, and if you find us worthy, we will be rewarded.
When the sequence starts, a bunch of tar elementals will spawn around us. We can ignore them for now because they don't do much damage. Instead, let's look at this 300-year-old whiskey, which gives us 5 skills, Drake's Breath. The description and tooltip would make you think this is just like the Elementalist dagger skill, but we get 5 of them. And well, if you use the ability, first there's a channel where nothing happens, then after that, on a delay, we start breathing fire in front of ourselves. I don't know why that precast channel is there, but the other weird thing about this is we can cast it on our friends. Look guys, an actual PvP friendly fire mechanic in Guild Wars 2. Something they never really wanted to add. There is no dueling feature, for example. Why can we do this? Well, because of the mechanics upcoming. The burning we apply there is not a regular condition, and it doesn't stack with other burning, but it will do more damage if you're a Condi build, so it's not a good idea to pick up this whiskey if you have loaded a bunch of condition damage onto your gear. So let's talk about these tar elementals. They're actually infinitely spawning. We can't get rid of them completely, unless we stand on these curiously new spawned tar spouts. You see this liquid? If I stand exactly where it is, it disappears. It's a really subtle, nice thing, not shown in the user interface in any way, a bit like the body mechanic we've been dealing with as well. And once Tyrix is standing on it, the tar elementals can't spawn anymore. So we can actually prevent them by standing on these specific places. It makes it another one of those rare occasions where you genuinely need at least 4 separate players to get through the instance. With 4 of us in position, stopping the tar, instead, all the liquid will burst out in the middle of the room and present us our main boss, the legendary Shogroth. Shogroth has a billion mechanics. First, let's look at these black tar pools he spawned. When I walk into them, I become covered in tar and get stunned. Now this isn't regular stun. It's completely disabled all of my abilities, so I can't stun break or use anything instant activation. And if my team isn't careful, we can all be hit with this, such that we can only stand there as we are cleaved out and killed by the tar elementals and the main boss himself. The boss has just disappeared though. That's because my friends were still able to hit him, and every 25% of his health, he'll hide underground again, prompting us to respawn him by moving back to the tar spouts around the outside. But how do we do that when we're stunned? This thing does eventually run out. You'll see on my ally here, it runs out in 30 seconds. I think the idea for the developers with the friendly firing whiskey bottle was that one player should be able to breathe fire on the tarred players and thus release them. But this interaction is broken, and as far as I can remember, has always been broken. So the friendly fire aspect of it is just a strange artifice that need not be there anymore. Your best way to get through that mechanic is to not step on the piles of black sludge Shogroth spawns in the first place. It can be very difficult if you're against a wall or just particularly unlucky, so don't feel too bad if you get hit by it. But amazingly, there is still another mechanic we can use involving this whiskey bottle that will stop that tar from being a threat too. I'll show that off in phase 2. First, we spread out, stand on the tar spouts. I'm just going to stand here with the bottle instead of cleaving away these tar elementals. When Shogroth spawns, this time, I'm going to use the whiskey bottle to inflict burning on him. Notice that before I can get the burning on him, right as he spawned, one of his first animations was to spit tar. Thankfully far away, but that's the regular black tar that if we walked into those red rings, we'd be stunned. However, once I've successfully got burning on him, his next animation of the same skill instead is not dropping tar, it's dropping these mini lava fonts. That's right. If he's burning, he can't tar you. Instead, his AoE fields just do regular damage. So that's the other purpose of the whiskey bottle. It allows you to apply burning to the boss and change dynamically one of his skills as he uses it. What a fantastic concept that you only see the devs playing with here on this one boss fight, as far as I remember. Not just in Core Guild Wars 2, but the entire game. I really think they should re-look back at this, because it's very fun. You don't need to use the whiskey bottle to apply burning. If you have an elementalist that specializes in burning, you can sustain it on him. If I, as a warrior, was using a longbow, I could drop my longbow burst skill and have him permanently burning. Necromancers could trait for doomfire and so on. But the whiskey bottle is there in the very rare and odd circumstance that you have a full composition of players that have access to 0 burning. The easiest way for us, probably here, would have been to have had the Ranger drop a Sun Spirit, meaning all of our attacks pulsed out on him, and the stun would never have been a thing. Here, unfortunately, you'll see, another 2 of us have been stunned, this time accidentally. I wasn't deliberately trying to show you the mechanic here, and we just have to wait it out. The other way around it is actually to go downstate. That will cleanse you, and weirdly, the friendly fire mechanic of the bottle is good for that too, but I'm pretty sure that's not what the devs had in mind. You might believe at this point I've shown you all the mechanics at play here, and there's a ton, right? But there's even another one that most players don't know about, and that's this. Shogroth will spawn more tar elementals himself. They're different to the ones that come out of the water spouts, in that if you do get stunned and covered by tar, you'll actually team swap to be allied to them, and they won't want to fight you anymore, viewing you as one of their friends. Strangely, it's only the Shoggoth spawn tar elementals that have this interaction, and the other ones that are likely to be lingering on the field will be your enemies still. But this is also then an early example of dynamic team swapping, something that we see the devs did pursue more of in later endgame content, but that's a story for another day. This final phase, we just want it to burn through properly. You can get his health down extremely quick, and with that done, we can move on to the next area of the dungeon.
I've got the Mystic Stone.
I will say, I'd like to see them fix what's broken about that fight, and maybe improve the quality of life on the fire whiskey bottle. The second phase that I was stunned in there happened because the burning really doesn't last very long, and it's such a clunky, long, slow animation. But hey, we got through just fine in the end. This next area is called Razor's Passage. Any reference to King Razor I can't get enough of, especially within Arah. And we have this one group of Risen to get through. Most of them are extremely squishy. There's actually only one elite here. It's this Hunter, who, as always, if you can reflect, you can kill very quickly. Even better, his axes will then bounce through all of his squishy friends, and you can get some really nice numbers. Following the Hunter is this group. Just 2 more Risen. One's an illusionist, we've seen a lot of, but the other is a berserker. Now he's a rare variety that you don't often see in Arah, and has an interesting fury intensity stack mechanic we'll look at later. And if you watch the Crucible of Eternity video, you'll remember this is actually one variety of Risen we fought in there. I pointed out that it would be a rare thing seen in Arah, and this is one of the very few occasions you'll find it. Mostly, we'll be looking at illusionists, hunters, elementalists, and mages. The later of those 2, I still haven't given you a good discussion on. Finally, we're at the top of the staircase, right that we were looking at the beginning of the dungeon, and can move to where all these archways actually lead to. But first, we have a whole field of things to wipe out. This whole area can be skipped, and I'll show you that technique on our subsequent paths. We do have to do this section 4 times after all. But for the first one, let's show what it looks like to actually break through the whole lot. Mostly, one of the biggest hazards here is over-aggroing and not looking out at the bodies on the floor, because they are littered everywhere. Also, in the center of this huge hive of Risen is a champion. It's a warrior, and obviously does do, as a champion, more damage than the others, and is tankier. Now that he has a break bar, I actually find him a lot more comfortable to deal with than in the early days. But if you've made the mistake of aggroing him amongst several others while there's bodies around and these turrets that you haven't successfully reflected, so your team's constantly blind, well, as you can guess, it's a bit of a nightmare. At the end of this section, we do find 2 elite undead abominations. I really think that the abominations weren't handled that well in this dungeon. They, to me, are some of the coolest undead enemies, and most of the ones you fight in Arah are just very squishy. There will be a proper boss later. These 2, you can generally cleave down. They're vulnerable to most CCs, and once they're dead, the door will open to a very, very, very special area and a very special boss.
Everything in moderation. including moderation.
You'll see, it's a huge thing called the Giganticus Lupicus, a creature referenced as having become extinct 10,000 years ago in the very first lore book to come with Guild Wars 1 prophecies. We heard about these at the very start of Guild Wars as a whole, years ago, but had never seen one. Only bodies littering the landscape that we speculated might have been them, until now, in the final dungeon of Launch Guild Wars 2.
This looks like an obsolete arena. And that body is a Giganticus Lupicus. I recognize it from the old texts.
Be careful. It may not be quite dead.
The Giganticus Lupicus died out over 10,000 years ago. Wait a minute. I think you're right.
So what a fantastic idea. You can see how this dungeon is entirely built around giving payoffs to lore nerds, referencing the ancient races and giving us new information we didn't have before, and even the Giganticus Lupicus is here, a creature still only available in this one area of the whole franchise. Look at how big and amazing he is as he slowly stands up. Of course, undead and corrupted. This is the creature I've been hinting at over the video. This, just like the ooze, is something to have survived for all these years, but now corrupted by Zhaitan. It's a brilliant place to fight it too. As you look around, we see all the arches leading out to the Cursed Shore and beyond all lead into this central area. I like to think that this is maybe where humans once patrolled for the favor of the gods, but now it's just a bit of a ruin. Lupi, as is known by the community, is not just notable as a massive lore bomb, but also as one of the most mechanically difficult and challenging bosses in the whole game. He has multiple phases, tons of mechanics, and a lot to watch out for. This is the guy people used to, for years, impress one another with solo kills and team speedrun records. This is where most truly good PvE Guild Wars 2 players would spend hours and hours practicing fighting what is generally the most loved, original launch Guild Wars 2 boss. If you think the ultimate Guild Wars 2 boss for launch, the one with the most prestige and notoriety, it's him. You're looking at it. Lupi. So let's talk about him, and there's a lot to get through. First, Phase 1. The first animation you'll see as I aggro him can be in any order, but he's going to roar. And as he roars, he'll summon some allies to his side, these elite locust swarms. They're fairly squishy, so should die to a lot of AoE, but be careful in solo fights to make sure to actually kill them, otherwise they can build up and end up killing you. Even when there's just 2 of them, they do a lot of damage. But that's not the main animation I want to look at. The second skill he uses is far more important for this phase of the fight. Here you'll see Lupi raises one of his hands high into the sky, and when he does so, he summoned an effect onto me. I'm surrounded by this green, nasty, plague-looking haze, and after a few seconds I'm knocked down, and a grub comes out of me. That grub will run back to Lupi, and when it's next to him, Lupi will eat it, giving himself increased power and armor, as the description says. So during Phase 1, there is a mechanic at play here where Lupi can keep making himself stronger and stronger and stronger by raising his hand, summoning this effect onto our players. After a delay, it runs out, spawning grubs that he eats. What's beautiful about this, and much of Arah, is that it's not a thing on the UI. You have no debuff on your active effects bar showing that this animation is there. You have to actually look at yourself in the middle of the fight to see if you've been struck with this. Of course, the animation itself is very obvious. A big hand going into the air, and you can actually dodge. That's the main thing I'd recommend, but you can also see here that when the grubs appear, if you're quick, you can crowd control them and kill them. That's not so easy if you get a grub to spawn while at his feet. So you have multiple ways to avoid this. Dodge the original animation when you have the green thing on you to run away from it, or make sure that you stun and kill those grubs as soon as possible. Here, Lupi seems to have become uninterested in using skills against me for some reason, so I have to walk back in, and I'll show you one final time. When his hand's in the air, I dodge, and you'll see it said evaded underneath my feet. Even though we don't necessarily know what it was we evaded, because we've examined the mechanic, we know that's avoiding the grub altogether. That's the main thing in Phase 1. When you walk next to him, he also has this powerful kick ability. That one's best prevented with Aegis, but since we don't have a Guardian, and our Mesmer isn't really casting Chaos Storm, we're going to have to rely on dodging more than anything else. Some groups would endeavour to just use range abilities for the whole fight, thus avoiding the kick and some of his other more dangerous melee things. Range stuff was generally slower, but could get the job done, and was often the safer route. I always enjoyed how there were two very distinctly different ways to tackle this fight, being a melee group or a pure ranged one. One more grub hits me here, I move away while the fight is in progress, and I go to take it out. My Bull's Rush there actually misses, but I've shown you there that it's not too difficult. There, I go to dodge another grub, but it was another member of my team here who was targeted, and they didn't dodge properly. If you're in the same situation I am, playing with pugs and people you're not familiar with, you'll have to aggressively keep an eye on them, making sure that if they get grubbed, you're in position to help them out, running over and cleaving it down. As you'll see is exactly what I do here. You can tell who Loopy is casting the grub on by watching the direction he's facing, but if you're all stacked closely together, which you probably should be, that's not that helpful. That's about it for Phase 1. Just a few skills to watch out for. Once you've cleared 1/4 of his health, he'll go invulnerable and enter Phase 2. Phase 2 starts with a lot of stuff at once. First is this animation. He'll cross his arms to his chest while bowing down, then erupt up in an explosive motion that triggers an enormous number of AoEs across the whole field. Most of these are aimed in the general area of your players, so the tighter you're all standing together, the more dangerous it becomes. Every single one is a projectile, and it can be extremely difficult to avoid. From now on, all the way through Phase 2, he will regularly do this, and it can be the #1 thing that wipes most groups. Here it is, for example, coming again. That animation can also be Lupicus's downfall, but I'll talk more about that on another path. For now, just know that you want to dodge very aggressively and pop defensives whenever you see that coming up, bundling together to heal again. Luckily, since we have a formal support, this Elementis that can revive us a lot, we can survive the animation pretty regularly. Again, our compensation could do a lot more to reduce the damage here, like having protection, but the resurrection method shows the deadliness, I think, quite well. At the start of Phase 2 also, something sneaky happens. Loopy will create an extra grub without having to do the big, extravagant one arm in the air animation. Even worse, he'll sometimes cast this on pets, like you can see it landed on our ranger's bear here, that has no opportunity of dodging it. So, unless you deal with that very quickly, quite often, Loopy will eat this grub almost for free, and that's the last one he'll do. In Phases 2 and 3, there's no grubs at play anymore. The other big difference with Loopy in Phase 2 is that now he has the ability to hit us from range. He throws this animation out, a projectile that he'll regularly sap away towards people while not doing his major big nuke. Try your best to get a lot of damage out in Phase 2, and move him into Phase 3, where he's not quite as deadly. This is the bit where most groups would wipe. Phase 3 starts when he gets to half health, once you've done the second quarter's worth of damage. Once again, as before, he'll go invulnerable, signaling his transition, and then you're in. In Phase 3, he does have some life steal mechanics that means he can heal. So if you don't do enough damage, he can actually put himself back into Phase 2 from the life steal, and you'll have to phase him again. So be careful of that. For the last half of the fight, he is less deadly. First, you get these domes. They're kind of like Guardian Rings of Warding. They'll lock you inside and do pulsing damage, and you can't escape unless you have a little bit of stability for yourself. They're really deadly to be inside, and I have heard that there is a slight safe spot within the ring right near the edge, but I've never found it. That animation actually only triggers if players are a very certain range away from him, so if you all melee at the exact perfect spots, you won't ever see it. But again, most of the groups I've played with over the years tend to have Lupicus cast just 1 or 2 of these. Bring some stability or a teleport out, and it shouldn't be that bad. I'll point out now that the break bar really doesn't play with Loopy. He's a boss that you're not meant to really be CCing, so when break bars came in, they tried to make it so you can't break his. You'll notice, however, that incapacitating conditions like chill and immobilize are steadily draining it, so you can abuse that these days in 2019 for a little bit of extra help. Another one of Lupi's animations here is this. It's a big life drain, targeting one player, doing 4 hits that are all really deadly. The only way to avoid all the impacts is to do 2 dodges in a row with perfect timing. This is the one that heals him if you let him hit you with it too much, and can be a real challenge when you're trying to solo the boss. In groups, that healing component doesn't really factor so much since he dies a lot quicker. Blocks also work against that one too, so do consider running something that lets you parry his abilities. The next animation is this. Gorgeous, isn't it? He jumps into the air, basically life-stealing heavy amounts from all around him. But the animation is slow enough that the idea is everyone needs to run away and get out to safety before then charging back on in. He'll rotate through these various life-gaining abilities as he nears death, and I've always liked the flavour and theming of that a boss, nearly killed, knows he's near his end, and is doing everything he can to survive. Oh, and that last animation has a bit of a blowout as well when he lands back down, so don't stand too close to him as he hits the floor again if you've really aggressively ran back in. The last Phase 3 animation to talk about before Lupi dies was this. It happened a bit earlier. Basically, just a ton of projectiles he's firing in one location that can be reflected or dodged away. Not as big a deal as it looks, and especially not compared to some of the Phase 2 deadliness. And there you have it. That is Lupi. We will have to fight him on every single Arah path, truly solidifying his place as a very deadly boss people had to look at. In many ways, Arah is a bit of a weird dungeon, because he's actually tougher than any of the final bosses we'll be looking at the end of the paths. Though I do remember my first time going through this, thinking just how insane the final bosses must be if he was only a thing in the interim. For the other paths, in the interest of time, I'll skip showing fighting Lupi, but there is a very fun strategy you can use to kill him extremely fast. You can keep an eye out for when we get to path 4.
I only hope that it's not the last one.
One thing I like about that epic death animation is there is a little subtle knockback right as he dies you can get hit with if you're standing next to him. Vara has a nice point as well, hoping that he's not genuinely the last one. Is that the real last Giganticus Lupicus? Are they truly extinct now? Well, the one we just fought did look pretty undead, but who am I to say? At this point, there are 4 doorways in Lupi's room, and depending on the path you picked, will change which of the 4 opens. For our purposes this time, we're going to be going down the southwestern door into this labyrinthine style area. Again, a whole section of the dungeon most players would skip. In fact, in truth, path 1, once you've killed Lupi, you don't have to do anything except walk through the ruined city to the area of the final boss and then kill it. Everything you're about to watch is totally ignorable with just a bit of stealth. And because of that, many players, including myself, used to solo or duo run Arah paths just to sell it at the end to players who weren't good enough to beat the bosses with full groups, or maybe couldn't commit the time. I used to make a lot of money doing exactly this. It means the footage you're watching, where everything's dying, is actually a bit of a different experience to most of my memories, where I think of these roads as, oh, dodge in this place, re-stealth up in this place, make sure you avoid this body, as the experience of rushing past the enemies is almost a totally different set of pieces of information you want to remember. Path 1 was always tricky to sell, because Shoggoth does require you have 4 players to spawn him and beat that boss, so you'd need to get some guildies to help you out in the earlier areas of the path, and then leave. Sometimes they'd want a cut of your profits, and there was a whole economy around that too. I really enjoyed this about Guild Wars 2. It reminds me of Guild Wars 1, Drox Forge running, or some of the endgame farms that used to happen there too. And I like that Arah and Guild Wars 2, for its time, had a similar experience. It didn't feel too far away from his younger brother. After these spiders, we come to this creepy, wide, derelict room filled with dead gorillas. Gorillas obviously are a part of Ore, and the devs did add one event to do with them. Defeat Korga, Lord of the Orion Gorillas. This, as I just finished mentioning, is skippable. You can wander past and not participate in this at all. In fact, many of the party members I'm doing this with right now in this video had never beat this guy. So let's show off how it works. First on the floor, is this Staff of Radiance with a trap skill on it called Focus Light. What we can do is just one player can pick this up and place traps down that do good crowd-controlled damage. Korga, you'll notice, has permanent stability. Now, that's a version of stability that cannot be stripped. So the only way, in theory, that you should be able to break his break bar or get past his Defiance mechanic when the game first came out is to drag him with his charging gorilla attacks into the lights we put down with these traps, and then, once he's stunned, we can get a bit of a burn phase going. It's a nice idea in that the defining quality of gorillas in this game is how much crowd control they have. Pulsing weakness, blowouts, knockdowns that last up to 6 seconds or more. And well, here we get to give them a bit of a taste of their own medicine. In truth, though, the mechanic is wonky as all hell. And you'll see even when he hits a trap, it doesn't do that much break bar damage. It's better to just beat him up, or use, just as with Lupicus, incapacitating conditions that will drain the break bar anyway, and you get basically a whole extra player that can now fight because they don't have to hold this pretty much useless environmental weapon. There's no lore or anything about that stuff. I wonder if the devs had something more planned later. And the only other defining thing about this fight is that as Korga gets lower, he continues resurrecting the bodies of all the other gorillas that line this street. Visually, I think it's a really fun idea here, as hordes of zombie gorillas slowly keep waking up, and the devs have forced you to walk past a bunch of their bodies already, so you know just how many there could be. Creepy stuff. Owing to his extremely tanky nature, plus all the crowd control, and the fact he moves around so much, I feel like I'm playing Monster Hunter right now. This was definitely a boss. Since you didn't have to fight him, people never really would. Do we declare this a bonus event then? I'm not sure I'm comfortable doing that, but for most of us, it certainly, probably to the developers' frustrations, wasn't a part of the game anyone really interfaced with. And I mean anyone. This is maybe only my second or third time killing it, and I try to do this stuff way more than most. With Korga defeated, I'll give you a glimpse of another part of Arah that if you've been watching closely, you might have seen I've hinted at with my positioning, but never gone the whole hog most of the time. Arah is very easy to break out of. Climb over walls you shouldn't, skip things and go places the devs clearly never intended. Well, here's one of the worst offenders that even today, in 2019, still hasn't been fixed. A blatant hole in the middle of the Golden Path Road every player will walk through while doing this dungeon. I've fallen down this hole accidentally more times than I've done it on purpose, but by coming down here, you're basically out of the dungeon. You can do a bunch of wonky jumps and go all over the place. I'm showing this because a huge part of the Arah experience for many years, and many players who really spent a lot of time here, was doing stuff exactly like that. Much of the dungeon has now been plastered with invisible walls from futile attempts from the devs to try and fix this stuff, but it's clear the dungeon itself was so hastily and shoddily put together and made, presumably right before launch, that even some of the most basic elements, like that hole in the floor, still to this day remain unfixed. This next room is full of spiders, and you're actually going to watch the team wipe here. I guess I'm so used to skipping these guys, I forgot how dangerous they genuinely can be. The main thing going on is there are 2 champion spiders just like Malrona from Twilight Arbor. That means twice the one-shot mechanics that we have to dodge. I was pretty confident while playing we would actually clean it down, but here I go down, and because this Orion spider doesn't die in time for me to rally, unfortunately, the whole thing goes kaput. I mean, 4 of us are alive here, but somehow the 2 champions managed to get the better of the lot of us, and Arah does get a legitimate party wipe, even in the power creep days of 2019. Thankfully, we did kill Korga, which allows us to go straight back to the Highborn King's waypoint and be back in seconds. Watching the video, you might think that that means that's incentive enough to kill Korga every run, but it's really not. The odds of wiping to these spiders is extremely low if you just choose to walk past them. The mechanic at play here is in this room, we can collect more of those reflecting crystals, and unlike the others in the dungeon, these ones infinitely respawn. We need to know to pick these up and carry them into the boss chamber just ahead. You can leave some players back here to pick up more, and that's what I said to do in communications, but I guess a lot of our team got bored, and we only end up with 2 crystals in the end. There's this cool chamber on our way to the boss room, which lights up with more Jotun runestones that start attacking us. Why the runestones have started being so antagonistic, I don't know. The spirits were nice to us up until now, right? But maybe it's just foreshadowing for the final boss in a second. I always found this room kind of interesting. Like a very feeble and weak attempt to give someone a bullet hell phase after the crazy stuff you've already been facing, like the loopy fight and the untold numbers of trash mobs. That's supposed to be a threat right at the end. I can't imagine they had much time to really refine the concept. They hardly do any damage. Moving on with our crystals, we can trigger the final boss in this beautiful room with one final door behind. It's a legendary Stargazer this time with the flavor text, Firestorm.
I know your desires. You seek the wisdom of the Jotun.
Yes. You will speak with us, and we will be worthy.
And the final challenge is to battle me.
Wait, what?
How deliciously Norn is this? Farah has an annoying habit of talking to these Jotun while standing really far away from them. It can be pretty frustrating to hear her dialogue at a correct volume. The Stargazer has 2 skills. One, this auto attack I'm reflecting for insane damage. I can only do this because I have the crystal, but as you should have noticed throughout the rest of the path, eventually the crystals break, like now, and suddenly I've become vulnerable. Not only does he have those projectiles, but also these ridiculous lava fonts. You'll see that not only killed me there, but 2 of my allies trying to resurrect me. It's really important you watch out for these and dodge away. Thankfully, we have an arcane resurrection elementalist that allows us to power through that, but that's not always possible, and one of us got defeated here. The entire boss, you'll see, is down to 50% health already, and that's because all you have to do is reflect him. That's why collecting lots of crystals can be a good idea, but since we only have 2, we're going to run out in a second, and things will become more challenging. It's not just crystal reflections you can use, by the way. Guardian Wall of Reflections or the various reflects available to the Mesmer profession are equally as powerful, and that's how we're going to end up getting through this. You can do regular damage to him. He's not invulnerable or anything. He's just super tanky. So, by stacking on him, giving might, and reflecting all at the same time, you can kill the Stargazer very quick. No match compared to Loopy. Lastly, there is that fire ring. It one-shots you and continues to close in. So if you take too long with the boss fight, you'll be surrounded and wiped to it. So that's a lot of our rewards in the pocket, but now for the best thing about Path 1, the ending story.
Beyond this gate should be the secret of the Jotun. Let me place the mystic stones the Jotun ghosts have provided. Success! We have found it!
Her dialogue is weird there, almost as though there was going to be another phase of the fight while we defended her as she placed the stones. But we'll move in. Her dialogue's at last updated. She says this is an amazing discovery. The Jotun Skysweeper shows a stellar match with the last time the dragons awoke. And we say, wait, what does this prove then? She says it shows that the awakening of the dragons is a natural and cyclical thing. The stars only indicate the passing ages. They do not determine the events here. So I guess that means our fate is still in our hands. When did it last happen? Around 10,000 years ago. You know what this means? The Elder Dragons might have been responsible for the extinction of the Giganticus Lupicus. And that's a community speculation we'd long made. We say that huge undead creature was 10,000 years old. Amazing. And close the dialogue. After this, we can move into this large back room called the Vaults of the Hidden.
There, the telescope of the Jotun.
And see the Jotun telescope ahead of us.
Excellent. I've checked the runes. Now let me examine the device itself. Yes. This clearly shows some new stars in the firmament, and they line up with the Jotun designs. The appearance of the Elder Dragons is reflected by the stars themselves. When they awaken, so do these new stars. This will be most helpful for our future work.
I was first familiar with dragons being linked to stars in the sky through the movie series Dragonhearts, but here in Tyria, it's shown to be a thing as well, that the heavens do update and reflect Elder Dragons. There's some beautiful irony here, as what we've just learned directly opposes Traherne's inspirational speech at the end of the game, where he said, the dragons are not stars in the sky and can be defeated. Why is that? Well, those are big questions and the nature of the eternal alchemy to be pondered later. But maybe you can use that information to watch the stars and know if any new Elder Dragons are about to awaken. The best thing about Arah Path 1 is this. Most players won't notice, because they can already leave the dungeon at this point. But if you walk up to the Jotun device, you can interact with it. You get this point of interest unlocking, called the Mystic Telescope, and a repeatable bonus cutscene showing this. It's the heavens, and as we pan up to look at the star, Tyria's star, I guess, you'll see it blackens out and becomes this creepy purple vortex. What is this? Is that supposed to be a physical representation of what Vara was just talking about? Because it doesn't seem to represent that. It seems to show a star disappearing. Is this showing Zaitan's defeat and the loss of Zaitan's star? Or something else? You know, guys, we've never, ever had a concrete answer about this. This is one of the great mysteries of Guild Wars 2 to this point. And you're welcome in the comments to leave your theories as to what the hell this is actually showing. Unfortunately, Vara won't appear in later stories, so all we can do is speculate and wonder what the Priory did with this device once they found it. That, everyone, is the end of Arah Path 1. Now we can return to the Cursed Shore and go for one of the other ancient races. Next will be the Masat. We've talked about a hell of a lot here, but thankfully, that's all groundwork we can skip over while playing the other paths. Join me next time for the final episode of the Dungeon series, where we see Path 2, 3, and the epic Path 4 for all the rest of the juicy lore, story, and mechanics in this badass ending dungeon. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you with Tyrix for that next time.